When it comes to discussing the most beautiful designs that General Motors has ever put together, there are generally three nameplates and years associated with them that come up as part of the conversation. The first is the 1966 Oldsmobile Tornado, which debuted General Motors' first mass-produced front-wheel drive system ever put in one of its automobiles. The next is the 1967 Cadillac Eldorado, which also shared the 1966 Tornado's front-wheel drive setup. However, the third vehicle in this trio is the 1966 and also the 1967 Buick Riviera, given the styling was nearly identical for both of these model years. The Riviera was an absolute styling masterpiece, as were the Tornado and Eldorado, but the Riviera deviated pretty significantly from its siblings. Most notably, while the Tornado and Eldorado were front-wheel drive, Buick decided to opt out of the front-wheel drive program, in part because of cost. In 1966 dollars, it's estimated that the front-wheel drive setup added between $400 and $500 of cost to the Tornado and Eldorado, which in today's dollars would be about $4,000 to $5,000. The other reason why Buick presumably opted out of the front-wheel drive program is that its engineers felt that the front-wheel drive setup made the cars too nose-heavy, and they couldn't get them to handle like they wanted. Buick at this time was known for having great handling vehicles that also rode well, and in a number of interviews, Buick engineers have discussed how they didn't like the way that the front-wheel drive setup made the overall cars handle. They just simply understeered too much when compared with the rear-wheel drive vehicles. Thus, while the Riviera was able to share a number of components from the Tornado, including its roof, glass, inner doors, cowl, as well as the rocker sills and rear section of the Tornado's floor pan, it did have its own unique frame that was atop a 119-inch wheelbase, 2 inches longer than the previous generation's 1963 to 65 frame. And this frame was used on no other vehicles and was an X shape in its overall design. Buick's chief engineer during this time period was somebody by the name of Lowell Kintig, who's unfortunately long since passed on. However, a number of individuals remembered Lowell as somebody who was able to refine a vehicle's ride and make specific changes simply based on his ability to sense what the car was doing and make recommendations associated with that. One of his recommendations on the Riviera was to increase the frame gauge thickness up one overall gauge from what the original proposal was so that the car had improved stiffness. This was also true on the 1965 to 70 Buicks, where the frame gauge and its overall thickness was a bit thicker than its sister divisions. Thus, the Riviera's unique X-frame coupled with four-coil suspension endowed the car with a wonderful ride and handling balance that frankly just wasn't present in the Tornado and Eldorados. This was in part due to the nose heaviness associated with the front-wheel drive, but also because the Tornado and Eldorado employed a completely different suspension setup for their vehicles, with torsion bars up front for the front wheels and out back single-leaf rear springs. The frame on the Eldorado and Tornado was also 3/4 length. It didn't go the length of the car. It terminated at the beginning of the rear leaf shackles. This was an interesting choice because the frame terminated at the exact place where all the stresses and strains from the leaf setup would be input into the car body. But that's how the engineers set it up. And it's a particularly interesting story in light of the fact that Buick actually engineered the final drive setup on the Tornado and Eldorado. Yes, that's correct. While Oldsmobile engineered a number of components, it was actually its sister division, Buick, that built and engineered the final drive setup for the front-wheel drive Tornado and Eldorado. When it came to design, Buick designers certainly had a tough act to follow in the 1963 to 65 Riviera, and the proposal for those 63 to 65 Rivieras came out of some advanced studios at GM, led by designer Ned Nichols. The car was also not originally scheduled to be a Buick at all, but really a LaSalle that would be sold by Cadillac. That was at least General Motors design vice president Bill Mitchell's vision for the vehicle, but Cadillac general manager James Roche had no interest in the vehicle, and thus Buick, Oldsmobile, and Pontiac were allowed to compete for the vehicle. Buick ended up winning out, and the 63 to 65 Riviera remains one of the most beautiful cars produced by GM. However, the 1966 Riviera is arguably an even better and cleaner design, and the design of the 66 Riviera was led by Dave Holes and his team. Dave also was responsible for designing a number of other famous General Motors vehicles, including the 1959 Cadillac and 60 Cadillac, as well as the 1972 Monte Carlo. Some of the design's overall dimensions and shape were derived for the Tornado, given the vehicles had to share a number of components. However, designers were able to come up with a completely different theme for the Riviera from the Tornado. You can see here in this photo how much the vehicles shared, but the Tornado also had a considerably longer front overhang than the Riviera did. Designers had originally been working on an exaggerated version of the 1965 Riviera, shown here, that would succeed it. However, once designers learned that they'd have to share considerable components with the Tornado, this overall theme had to go. Designers also investigated a number of themes with grills in the edges of the front fenders, something that would have carried over from the 1963 to 65 generation, but it ended up not making it on the final production vehicle. And in the end, the Riviera's front end got another version of the so-called W shape in plan view, or view from above, something that first appeared on the 1964 Electra. This was done in part to make the front end look considerably different than the 66 Tornado, as both had these blade-like fenders, but despite the fact that they have similar fender forms, the front ends look very, very different. Another key consideration in the design of the 66 Riviera were its hidden headlights. The previous 1965 Riviera had headlights hidden into the fenders in those grille shapes that would open up when the headlights were turned on. The 66 Riviera employed a much simpler mechanism where the headlights just rotated down 90 degrees from their resting spot. But one element from a styling perspective that General Motors VP Bill Mitchell was very passionate about was that when the headlights were on, that they didn't look ugly like they did on some other cars, and in part on the 1966 Tornado. Thus, designers came up with a beautiful theme for the headlights, and the car looked good with them on or off. Something that really can't be said of a number of vehicles, particularly Fords of the era, where when the headlights are on, it looks very unfinished and overall strange from a design perspective. Another beautiful styling element of the 1966 Riviera are its wheels. These were designed by designer Jerry Brockstein, an individual who also was responsible for the Cadillac Voyage concept car in later years. And the wheel covers were inspired by Bugatti's straight-laced wire wheels. These wheels proved so popular that Chevrolet picked them up for a number of their vehicles, including the Corvette. And in fact, the Riviera and Corvette wheels are absolutely identical, but for the center hub that you change out from the Riviera logo to the Corvette logo. Chevrolet also used similar turbine vane wheel covers on other vehicles, including Monte Carlos and Caprices. And even Ford joined in the turbine vane theme, having optional wheel covers on LTDs and Mercurys that were very similar in theme to that employed on the Riviera. Overall, the 1966 and 67 Riviera's design is just a pinnacle in GM design history, and it beautifully carried over some elements from the 1963 to 65 Riviera and that so-called Ferrari Rolls-Royce theme, but did so in a package that enabled it to share a number of components with its sister vehicles, the Eldorado and the Tornado. The car also had just a gem of an engine under hood, whether you pick the 66 or 67 model year, although the engines are different. In 1966, the Riviera used a 425 cubic inch V8 that was carried over from the 63 to 65 versions as an optional engine, and it made 340 horsepower. It was Buick's so-called nailhead engine that didn't breathe all that well. It came standard with a 4-barrel carburetor, had a dealer optional 2 4-barrel carburetors, but after 1966, Buick engineers recognized they had taken the engine about as far as they could when it came to performance, and a new engine was introduced in its place, the Buick's 430 cubic inch V8 for 1967, and that made 360 horsepower. Having driven both, I can say that they are equally smooth and wonderful engines. The one thing that you do have to be concerned about a little bit is make sure if you buy a 1967 version that you don't hear any upper valve train noise when the engine is running. They were known for that, particularly if the oil wasn't changed on a regular basis, because the push rods are not hollow. In fact, they're solid. So the upper valve train has to get oiled through relatively small oil passages. And if the oil isn't changed enough, you can run into issues. Both engines were backed by GM's wonderful turbohydromatic 400 transmission, which during these years still had a switch pitch converter, meaning it had two stall speeds so that you could take advantage of performance if you depressed the throttle pedal more than 2/3 of the way, or if you wanted economy, the stall speed was lower if you did not really step on the accelerator pedal all that hard. It's a wonderful setup that unfortunately only existed for a few model years on these General Motors turbohydromatic 400s, and 1967 would be the last year for it. Hope you enjoyed the spotlight on a piece of, let's call it design perfection, the 1966 and 67 Riviera. If you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you.